Please be seated. The court is now back in session. I hand over the floor now to the co-prosecutor to resume her closing statement. You may proceed. Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to now resume my statement. Faced with such massive suffering, the CPK leaders refused all offers of international assistance and prevented the Red Cross from assisting the evacuees. Former cadre Ing Pan testified in this chamber that, quote, at the time they used the phrase, "You have to rely on yourself," unquote. On the ground in Phnom Penh, the UN representative in Cambodia, Fernand Scheller, offered the Khmer Rouge real practical humanitarian assistance. He described to Sidney Schanberg how he was met with a swift and negative response. He says, quote, "They are like people from another planet. I told them that I am at their disposal if they wish us to help. I said I had 42 experts waiting in Bangkok to come back and help. And they laughed," unquote. Mr. Schanberg also recorded in his diary a conversation he had on the 18th of April with Murray Carmichael, a Red Cross surgeon who could not contain his anger at witnessing the human catastrophe which was emerging. Quote, "They haven't got a humanitarian thought in their heads," says Murray Carmichael, a doctor on the Red Cross surgical team, who describes the emptying of one of the hospitals yesterday. He continued, "They threw everyone out, even paralytics, critical cases, people on plasma. Many will die. It was just horrible." The insurgents had forced Carmichael to abandon a patient in mid-operation at the Red Cross surgery in the Hotel Le Phnom, unquote. In such conditions, the deliberate lack of assistance could only mean intentional mistreatment. In such circumstances, the death of thousands was not only foreseeable, but inevitable. And as I said earlier, inherent in the very decision of the party center to evacuate the city. And for this, Khieu Samphan praised the concurring forces as liberators of the people. In a victory speech he broadcast in the early morning hours of the 22nd of April 1975. In his words, quote, "The enemy died in agony," unquote. I have already described some of the evidence before your honors, which demonstrates the large numbers of deaths that resulted from the extreme conditions to which the evacuees were subjected. Now, I will address the evidence of death in more detail. The forced evacuation of the population of Phnom Penh caused some 20,000 deaths in total. In his empirical study, Ben Kiernan concluded that over 10,600 people were likely to have died en route from Phnom Penh to their initial destinations. He estimates that another 10,000 died from executions during the evacuations. Your honors have heard evidence of numerous instances of killings of civilians by Khmer Rouge troops. Residents were killed for refusing to leave their homes or not living fast enough, for bringing too many personal belongings, or simply for disregarding orders of the Khmer Rouge forces. Madame Jum Sowan described one such an event. I quote, "They were armed, including men and women, with the red scarf. They told us that the upper Angkar asked us to leave. They gave us only 15 minutes. If we refuse to leave, they will enforce their measure. I saw in Orisay market, one of the houses were locked. When I returned from the market, when they knocked the door and the door was not open, they shot the lock, and when the people came out, they shot the people to death, and I ran away from the scene." Unquote. Penjathai, to whom I have referred earlier, confirmed to you the following account from his book. Quote, "We had covered no more than half a mile when I heard a gunshot. Up the street lay the body of a young man. He was about 18. Some 15 yards away from him, a soldier stood, smoke still wafting lazily upwards from his AK-47. Within a minute, word reached us that the boy had forgotten something in his house. He had turned back in defiance of the soldier's order and was about to re-enter his house when the soldier shot him. The soldier had exclaimed, 'This is what happens to recalcitrants.' Khmer Rouge troops also murdered people who resisted their looting of the few belongings that the evacuees took with them. Toj Pondarasa described this in her testimony before your honors as follows. Quote, "And then suddenly I heard a voice saying, 'Give me the watch.' A very aggressive voice, and since I was afraid of losing my children, whom I had tied together. Then I heard a gunshot. And then I saw a man who had just been killed. And that is when I understood that things were very, very serious. And we were all very, very afraid. Unquote. Khmer Rouge soldiers even murdered newborn infants who were crying from hunger. She Ainley told Your Honors what she saw. Quote, when we were leaving Phnom Penh and we were traveling along National Road Number 1, crossing Monivong Bridge, I saw a crying baby. He was actually crawling over the dead body of his mum. I wanted to carry that baby. I wanted to take the baby. From the time when I wanted to carry the baby and the soldier carried this baby was so brief that I could not actually do anything. But all of a sudden, when the soldier carried this baby, they just tore the baby apart. It was a very horrifying scene. I could not imagine any human being who would do that. Unquote. The total contempt of city resident and human life was inculcated in Khmer Rouge troops. The soldiers were authorized and permitted to kill at their discretion. I referred earlier to the evidence of Kung Kim, a former Khmer Rouge soldier who stated that Khmer Rouge troops faced no punishment for killing civilians. Here is another pertinent excerpt from his OCIJ statement. Quote, when we arrived in town, if we wanted to shoot people, we just did it. We would not be punished for doing that because they were our enemy. Unquote. Kung Kim also revealed in court how the CPK forces determined that people were enemies after they had already been killed. I quote, many ordinary people were also killed because combatants who no longer had such respect for life could basically shoot anybody they like except fellow combatants. And there was no punishment for such killings of ordinary people who once shot were enemies.
ក៏បានលើកឡើងផងដែរពីការ
I refer earlier to the death of the most vulnerable during the evacuation. Numerous eyewitnesses have confirmed in this chamber that the most vulnerable infants, children, the elderly, the disabled, the sick, pregnant women starved to death during the transfer. Pe Chui Chipsai stated, quote, as for those who die along the roads, they die of 1. Starvation, 2. Because of diseases and they did not have medicines or they did not have anyone to look up to. For example, young children had no breast milk to feed, so they starved to death. And that was the misery. I cannot describe them all. Unquote. An account from Dr. Van Hai describes how on his march from Phnom Penh he saw the body of a child about every 200 meters. Bay Sopani saw the road lined with dead bodies, the bodies of Lon Nol soldiers, the bodies of elder people, the bodies of children and pregnant women. Punjathai, whose account I have already referred to, testified before your honors. Quote, the further we traveled from the capital, the more exhaustion claimed the sick, the injured, the lame, and the old. Increasingly, we began to see bodies left beside the highway until we were no longer shocked by the sight. Unquote. Numerous evacuees were also executed upon arrival at rural destinations or succumbed to the harsh conditions of the travel, compounded by the inhumane condition in which they were placed upon arrival. Own Polly testified that her uncle was sent to study within 10 days of his arrival and was never seen again. In our submission, one fact is established beyond any reasonable doubt. Each and every death on a massive scale was a direct and inevitable consequence of the party center's decision to evacuate the cities and to search for and eliminate enemies during and immediately after the evacuations. The evidence of the actions of these accused before, during, and after the event establishes that they intended those deaths and that they knew that those deaths would occur. I would now like to address your honors on the second forced transfer. During the course of this trial, we have all referred to the first forced transfer and the second forced transfer. This can give an impression that there were only ever 2 incidents of forced transfer carried out by the CPK. The truth is that the CPK policy of forced transfer was a continuing policy and that people under CPK control were being moved consistently from the early 1970s onwards. Even in 1975, people were moved consistently in the months after victory. So the second forced transfer was the continuation of a series of crimes. New people who were already the victims of crimes committed by the CPK leadership on and after the 17th of April 1975 were again those targeted for systematic discrimination and mistreatment. They had already suffered from being exploited through forced labor in inhumane conditions. They had already suffered from enslavement. Many of them had also been murdered in a pattern of extrajudicial executions nationwide. Thousands had already died from overwork, starvation, and disease. As a group, They had already been subjugated, suppressed, and punished. The new people were a mere resource to serve the criminal designs of Khieu Samphan, Nuon Chea, and their party. They were not flesh and bone. They were units of production to be systematically exploited. Professor Chandler testified, quote, "These people were not considered to have any value whatsoever as human beings. These were not people that the victors respected. These were people who had chosen not to join their ranks." Unquote. Your Honors heard testimony from a man called Panjathai, who wrote a book about his experiences called Stay Alive, My Son. He was one of the new people. I will refer to him later because he is an important witness. He was a victim of a forced transfer from Samoliu to a forest in Vilvung in September 1975. He described the second forced transfer as nothing more than another step in our destruction as new people. The party center, including Nuon Chea and Khieu Samphan, had therefore already put in place an organized system of ill treatment. The decision to move the new people once again was not justified on humanitarian or economic grounds. The second forced transfer was intended to further the pre-existing crimes. It did not bring suffering to an end. It extended and magnified suffering. The criminality was on a grand scale. In imposing by force the party line to achieve 3 or more tons per hectare of rice harvest, the party center was relentless and committed to achieving that objective at all costs. Khieu Samphan and Nuon Chea and other members of the party center ordered its rank and file to advance at all costs their plan of building the country, which went in tandem with defending the country. The CPK were masters at couching their language in such a way as to disguise their real intentions and motives. Building the country did not mean consolidating a voluntary, paid labor force, improving living conditions, attracting investment, or seeking to sell produce on regional markets. Neither did it reinforce social solidarity, a meaningful sense of community, or enrich the material and spiritual life of the nation. No, it meant continued enslavement, forced labor, and death. The party center talked of entering a stage of socialist revolution as if this was an egalitarian program with the aim of alleviating suffering. Kyusampon defense asserts that the second forced transfer was an economic program to manage the food crisis. It was not. Just in the same way that the new democratic revolution the party center had pursued before coming to power was not about democracy, but rather about coercion, subjugation, and death. One has to look at the reality of what happened to the victims, not the disingenuous rhetoric used by the party center to hide their true mission. Equally, the party center's plan of defending the country became the all-encompassing justification for executing thousands of innocent victims killed because of their perceived associations. The second forced transfer arose out of a series of meetings. The party line of building the country became a priority after it achieved power. At these meetings, the party center explained this policy and ordered that it would be followed and implemented nationwide. The second forced transfers started very soon after the Standing Committee visit to the Northwest Zone in August 1975. CPK documents first discuss rice yield quotas, and then the CPK leadership ordered the transfers to start. The goal of increasing production at breakneck speed was not a minor item on their collective agenda. Together with the killing enemies, it was a predominant objective. These meetings and the Standing Committee's visit are important because they demonstrate how the party leadership plan decided on and executed their criminal plan. They show that both accused were active participants and knew what was going on. Nuon Chea defense have stated that Nuon Chea maintains that the decision to implement the second population movement was taken by zone leaders, not by the party center. First, this is merely an assertion. It is not supported by any actual evidence from Nuon Chea. He could, of course, have continued to testify and explain his position, but he chose not to do so. We urge you, Your Honor, to consider the evidence of the second forced transfer and not the unsupported assertion argued on paper at the last minute in a closing brief. When Your Honors assess the evidence, you will be sure that plan came from the party center and was implemented by the party center through a highly centralized and disciplined hierarchy, not some isolated, errant behavior by zone leaders. In May 1975, the Central Committee met for 10 days at the Silver Pagoda to discuss the post-liberation situation and to make plans for achieving the party's next goal of socialist revolution. The meeting was presided over by Pol Pot and Nuon Chea, with Pol Pot presenting the party documents and Nuon Chea leading the discussions. Khieu Samphan and Ieng Sari participated in the meeting, which was attended by people from all zones. The Central Committee discussed the evacuation of Phnom Penh, building and defending the country, building the progressive cooperatives, and speeding up the process of the construction of dams and canals. Khieu Samphan testified in his trial that the main agenda of the May 1975 meeting was to urgently rebuild the country through socialist revolution and reconstruction, which meant that all land was to be placed under cooperatives. The Central Committee decided that the country must be built and that socialism must be built as rapidly as possible. This was not a case of building agriculture from a base of freedom or choice. It was not about harnessing a willing and energetic, well-fed and cared-for workforce to achieve social change. It was crude, brutal, and criminal. It was about building agriculture through forced transfers, mistreatment, continued enslavement, and death. After the Central Committee had decided upon its plan, it was necessary for it to be communicated to representatives, right down to those at the district level, those who would have to ensure that the plans were implemented. So from the 20th to the 25th of May 1975, the CPK leaders held a large conference in Phnom Penh. This conference was attended by the secretaries of every district, sector, and zone, and representatives of all military units. This conference was highly significant. It lasted 5 days and was attended by many leaders from all levels of the CPK and across the entire country. This was the meeting where the party center would order the implementation of its post-victory party lines. The speaker at the conference were Pol Pot and Nuon Chea. They both instructed the CPK cadres on the party lines and policies that were to be implemented throughout the country. One of the CPK cadres present at the conference was Witness Sao Sarun, then a district secretary in Mondulkiri. He testified that the subjects discussed by Pol Pot and Nuon Chea at this meeting included cooperative organization, currency prohibition, market and monastery closings. The CPK cadres were significantly instructed to organize cooperatives in their regions encompassing 30 to 40 families per each cooperative. They were also informed that the party center had decreed that all private property was to be eliminated, and Pol Pot talked about driving all the Yuen from Cambodia. In August 1975, the CPK Standing Committee made a 5-day trip to the Northwest Zone. The minutes of that tour proved that party leaders received reports on the people's situation, enemy situation, border activities and internal activities, military situation, and the status of rice planting and various industries. The document reflects how the party leaders were keeping an eye on the implementation of their policy to smash enemies. The minute states, quote, "There exist within our ranks those who have not yet been purged. They make use of them to lead people to flee. We have been able to arrest them one after the other, and are now continuing to search them out." Unquote. The Standing Committee learned from this visit that the new people in the Northwest Zone were experiencing shortages of food supplies as well as shortages of medications. This is important. Here you have the Standing Committee confirming in its own report that people in the Northwest Zone did not have enough food. The defense would have you believe that the CPK leadership was misled by their subordinates in the cooperatives as to the true situation on the ground. This document proves otherwise. It also shows the party center knew that the area to which they were about to transfer forcibly 500,000 people already had pressing food shortages. The report reveals that although the new people in the Northwest were suffering badly, the base people were in a comparatively better position. For them, there were not yet shortages of livelihood, as the party had directed that base people be continually supply war booty from the towns previously occupied by the new people. Based on its tour of the Northwest Zone, the Standing Committee made a number of decisions and provided a number of instructions. The most important decision was to move large numbers of new people to the north and northwest. Quote, "Workforce must be allocated to those who have free land to plant and diversify crops while in the meantime defending the country. Besides, the workforce must be provided to any place with more work ability." Unquote. The CPK leaders decided that the labor force in that region must be increased, including, quote, 300,000 or 400,000 more would not be enough. The current strength of 1 million persons can only work 50%. It is imperative to add 400,000 or 500,000 more, unquote. In this document, the party center once again headlined its plan to continue persecuting the new people in order to punish the supposed bad elements among them. The words of the committee are chilling and unambiguous. Quote, "The function of cooperatives, since the total liberation, is to absorb all the new people coming out of all cities and towns, especially Phnom Penh City and in the northwest Battambang. Every time of horrible elements exists among the hundreds of thousands of new people in Battambang. but the cooperatives have absorbed them completely. Things are okay with the base people, but be vigilant against no good elements among the new people taking advantage of things, because these contemptibles would not stay with us even if we were to give them sufficiency. Your Honours, the evidence proves the party leaders' determination to move 400,000 or 500,000 people. The Nuon Chea defense argue that this passage evidences nothing more than a vague desire. But as your Honours have seen from the evidence throughout this trial, the Standing Committee was not a body interested in theoretical expressions. When the Standing Committee or the Party Centre orders a measure as an imperative, that measure is implemented throughout the party structures. Of course, the best evidence of this in relation to the second forced transfer is the event itself. They ordered the transfer, and the transfer took place. In September 1975, the CPK leaders distributed a policy document that discussed the implementation of the party's agricultural line to push agriculture to expand in a great leap to the maximum according to the instruction of the party, and assess the situation during the past 4 to 5 months since the party disseminated the line in May 1975. The document stressed the importance of building dams, paddy dikes, and canals, noting that dams could be built in large groups and by hand. It effectively ratified the Standing Committee's decision to move 500,000 people to the north and the northwest zones. In this document, the Party Centre discussed a rice harvest quota of 3 tons per hectare and the need to export rice in order to raise capital. The September 1975 document demonstrates the knowledge of the party leaders of shortages in all aspects of life, including shortages of supplies to produce food, shortages of medicines leading to sickness and pain, malnourishment, and malaria. The document also recognizes that the people with the greatest shortage are those who were evacuated from Phnom Penh and the surrounding areas. It further records the leaders' knowledge that people were working 15 hours a day due to the lack of sufficient machinery, which, as the document confirms, was having an impact on health of our people. Your Honours, we submit that the August 1975 minute of the Standing Committee and the September 1975 policy document should be read together. They both confirm significant decisions. They both recognize the severity of the shortages afflicting the new people. They both recognize that the leaders were fully aware of these conditions. And they both record that it was the CPK central leadership that determined to initiate the second force movement. According to the September document, I quote, "In the northwest, we must add an additional force of 500,000 people. Pravihir has requested 50,000 first. In Previhir, there is the possibility of solving food supplies. Previhir has 70,000 old people already, so send 20,000 first as we go along. And in the north, they need people to be given to Kampung Thom province. The east also needs forces to be given to sectors which are short of people. So each zone must make appropriate preparation and not let things sway back and forth, allocating how many to upper level and moving how many to other locations." Unquote. Your Honours, this extract I have just read refers specifically to the North Zone and the East Zone having to make preparations to receive and send people. In due course, I will discuss a telegram sent in November 1975, which discusses the difficulties these zones were experiencing with transferring so many people, and illustrate that both zones were under the party center's direction. Contemporaneous evidence confirms the party center resolutions to rapidly increase production through the use of forced labor, resolutions which are intricately connected with the decision to implement the second forced transfer. The October-November 1975 issue of the Revolutionary Flag confirms that the party center's quota of rice production of the 3 tons per hectare was endorsed at the first countrywide economic congress in early November 1975. The language used makes it abundantly clear that the party center was ordering his party line to be an absolute priority by declaring that 3 tons per hectare quota was the common resolution for the entire party, the whole population, and the whole revolutionary army. The evidence demonstrates clearly that these decisions and orders were transmitted through the organized structure of power of the CPK to the very lowest levels. And this is corroborated by the accounts of the victims who have described what they were told by the Khmer Rouge cadres. Your Honours will notice how the reasons mirror exactly the orders from the party center. In Kandal province, in the southwest zone, TCCP 45 was told by the Khmer Rouge that, quote, "They moved us to Battambang province because soil was more fertile and there was more land for cultivation." Unquote. In Swai province, in the East Zone, a villager who provided a statement to the investigator of the ECCC in document E3/5258 was told by Khmer Rouge cadre at a village meeting for new people that, quote, "Based on the super great leap forward line, brothers and sister new people had to go to live in Posat province." Unquote. In light of this evidence, Your Honours, it is untenable for Nuon Chea to assert in his closing brief that the order to forcibly transfer the population did not originate from the party center. Yes, the zone was involved, but they were not acting autonomously. They were carrying out the plans, policies, and decisions as tools to implement the plans of the center. In their closing brief, the Khieu Samphan defense assert that the forced movement of population to an apparently fertile region demonstrates that there was an economic reason justifying such movement. They say that this was an attempt to remedy food shortages, even if it failed in part. Again, like his comrade Nuon Chea, Khieu Samphan fails to offer a scintilla of evidence to support his claim. He also makes this claim after the end of the evidentiary proceedings, in which he withdrew from testifying before he could be questioned by the judges, prosecutors, and other counsel. But Khieu Samphan's submission also completely misses the point. Irrespective of what disingenuous reason the CPK leaders put forward for the transfer, the evidence show that this was a wholly criminal enterprise, criminal because it effected through crimes, persecution of the new people, enslavement, imprisonment, murder, utterly inhumane treatment. In other words, it was a continuation of the common criminal plan. The CPK leadership knew that the movement of such a large number of people in such a short time to the northwest zone would exacerbate the food crisis and that people would inevitably die. There was simply not enough food to feed the 500,000 people who were marked to transfer, often to the remote jungle. The new people had no skills, experience, or tools for farming. How could anyone have expected them to survive? Indeed, Your Honours, they did not survive. Ng Thiret admitted in an audio tape interview in 1980 that she conducted an inspection tour to the northwest zone in the second quarter of 1976. She observed inhumane conditions in the areas where hundreds of thousands of people had been relocated. She stated, quote, "In Battambang, I saw something very clear, that they make people, all people going to the rice field very far from the village, and they have no home. They are all ill. I saw everybody there in the rice field in open air, nothing, and with the sun, very hot sun. I saw many people ill of diarrhea and malaria." Unquote. It is essential to a proper understanding of the facts to recall that this trip took place several months after the forced transfer had started. At Jet, there was still no shelter. People were suffering. They were suffering because they were slaves, indispensable from start to finish. There is absolutely no evidence before you that center took any steps at any point to improve the condition of the evacuees or alleviate their sufferings. The strident orders of the party center were put into effect, and the second forced transfer began in September 1975. The evidence shows that the inevitable crimes that formed part of the plan were well underway by November 1975. Mr. President, I observe that we are quite close to 4 o'clock now. I don't know whether or not you want me to continue, or I shall pause here and resume tomorrow? I need around half an hour to go to complete this. The President. Well, since the prosecutor will have 2 more days to go, then we can pause here and resume tomorrow. The time is now appropriate for the day adjournment. The chamber shall adjourn now and resume tomorrow, the 18th of October 2013, starting from 9 o'clock. And the chamber wishes to advise the party and inform the public that tomorrow the chamber will grant the floor to the prosecution to resume their closing statement. Security guards are now instructed to bring Mr. Khieu Sampon and Mr. Nuon Chea back to the detention facility and have them return to participate in the proceeding before 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. Mr. Khieu Sampon is to be brought to this courtroom, whereas Mr. Nuon Chea is to be brought to the holding cell downstairs, where audio-visual equipment is installed for him to follow it remotely. The court is now adjourned.